"I feel nothing when you touch me." Those were the words that shattered me, words that stripped away every ounce of pride, effort, and hope I had poured into my marriage. And when she said them, her eyes weren't filled with regret or confusion. They were blank, as if she were announcing the weather. In that moment, something in me broke, but instead of begging, instead of pleading like she might have expected, I looked her dead in the eye and whispered, "Feel this," before I turned and walked away, leaving her in stunned silence. You might think it ended there, but the truth is, this was only the beginning of the unraveling. Let me take you back to how it all started, and how I reached the point where the woman I loved most confessed she felt absolutely nothing. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Adrian, and for most of my life I thought I had a pretty clear idea of what love was supposed to look like. I grew up in a small town in Oregon, raised by parents who had been married for over 35 years, the kind of couple who held hands in the grocery store and danced in the kitchen on random Tuesday nights. That's what I wanted for myself. A partner who made the world feel a little lighter, someone who would stick around even when life wasn't perfect. And when I met Clara during my second year of working at a software firm in Portland, I truly believed I had found exactly that. She wasn't like the other women I'd dated before. Clara had this quiet confidence about her, the kind of presence that drew you in without her needing to say a word. She was a graphic designer at a small agency across town, and we met at a mutual friend's barbecue. While everyone else buzzed around making small talk, she was sitting on the porch swing with a plate of watermelon in her lap, sketching something on a napkin. I remember walking up to her and asking what she was drawing, and she looked at me with this half smile and said, "People. I like capturing them when they think nobody's watching." That was the moment she had me hooked. We talked for hours that day, about art, about technology, about childhood dreams, and where we saw ourselves in 10 years. By the time I left that party, I couldn't get her out of my head. And when I asked for her number a week later, she didn't hesitate. Our first date was at a tiny cafe that smelled like cinnamon and roasted coffee beans, and I remember thinking how effortless it felt to be around her. Like I didn't have to perform or impress, I could just be Adrian. The early days were nothing short of magical. We went hiking every other weekend, explored hole-in-the-wall restaurants, stayed up late talking about books we were reading. Clara had this way of seeing beauty in the smallest details, and she taught me to slow down, to notice things I'd usually rush past. She'd stop in the middle of a busy sidewalk just to point out the way the sunlight bounced off a window, or she'd laugh at how a stranger's dog carried its leash in its own mouth. Those were the kinds of things she lived for, and I loved being pulled into her world. I remember one evening vividly. It was in late autumn. We were walking through Forest Park, the air crisp and filled with the smell of damp leaves. Clara stopped, looked around at the canopy of golden light, and whispered, "This feels like home." She didn't mean the forest. She meant us. She meant me. And in that moment, I believed with every fiber of my being that this was it. This was the woman I'd spend my life with. It didn't take long before I introduced her to my parents. They adored her instantly, mostly because she asked my mom for her recipe for apple pie and actually followed up by baking it the next week. My dad admired her curiosity, the way she asked thoughtful questions about his old carpentry projects. For me, it felt like everything I'd ever wanted was falling into place. Within 2 years, Clara and I had moved into an apartment together in the Pearl District. It wasn't huge, but it had floor-to-ceiling windows and a balcony where we grew herbs in little pots. At night, we'd sit out there with glasses of wine, watching the city lights flicker, and I'd feel like the luckiest man alive. And I'll admit, maybe I was naive. Maybe I was too blinded by the glow of what I thought was love to see the cracks forming beneath the surface. But at that time, all I saw was possibility. I thought the woman beside me shared the same dreams I did, that our lives were intertwined not just in the present, but stretched far out into the future. That's why, when I proposed to her on a cold December night in the middle of Pioneer Courthouse Square, while Christmas lights sparkled above us, I had no doubt she'd say yes. She cried, said she couldn't imagine life without me, and kissed me like the world had just stopped spinning. We were married the following summer in a small vineyard outside the city. It was intimate, only close friends and family, with string lights hanging between the trees and music that carried into the warm night. When Clara walked down the aisle, I couldn't breathe. She was radiant, and the thought that this incredible woman was choosing me, it was overwhelming in the best way. As we danced to our first song, her head resting on my chest, I told myself I'd never let anything come between us. That night, I lay awake beside her, staring at the ceiling, thinking, this is forever. But forever turned out to be a lot shorter than I imagined. Married life with Clara began with a rush of excitement. We spent our honeymoon in Italy, wandering cobblestone streets and getting lost in small towns where neither of us spoke the language. I remember one afternoon in Florence, we sat on the steps of a cathedral eating gelato, laughing about how badly I had butchered an attempt to order in Italian. She snapped a photo of me with ice cream dripping down my chin, and it became her favorite picture. She'd put it on the fridge later, claiming it captured my true essence. Those early months felt like a dream, a kind of intoxicating blend of adventure and security. Back home, we built a rhythm. Our apartment filled with little pieces of us. Her sketches taped to the walls, my shelves of books spilling into the living room, the smell of coffee brewing every morning before work. Clara would leave notes on the fridge, sometimes simple reminders, other times doodles of the two of us holding hands. I cherished those details. They seemed to prove that we were aligned, that the love we felt would only deepen over time. I was proud to be her husband. At work, I found myself bringing up Clara in conversations, eager to share her latest design project or how she had made the living room feel like an art studio. My coworkers would smile and tease me about being a newlywed still in the honeymoon phase, but I didn't care. I believed what we had wasn't just a phase, it was solid, enduring. Clara seemed to believe it too, at least in those days. Our weekends were filled with rituals. Saturday mornings we'd wake up late, walk down to the farmer's market, and come back with bags of fresh produce. Clara loved experimenting in the kitchen, and I was always her enthusiastic taste tester. Sunday evenings, we'd curl up on the couch, watching movies while she absent-mindedly traced circles on my hand. It was in those quiet moments that I felt most content, most certain that we had something real. Of course, not everything was perfect, and I didn't expect it to be. Clara had quirks, like her tendency to withdraw into her own world when she was stressed, shutting me out until she sorted through things on her own. I, on the other hand, was the type who wanted to talk everything out immediately. Early on, these differences seemed manageable, even complimentary. I had learned to give her space, and she'd eventually let me in. It was a dance we performed without much friction. I think back now to a conversation we had about children. We were sitting on the balcony, a bottle of wine between us, the city buzzing faintly below. I had brought it up casually, wondering what she thought about starting a family someday. Clara grew quiet, her gaze fixed on the streetlights. "Someday," she said finally, "but not soon. I don't want to lose myself." At the time, I respected that answer. We were still young, still finding our footing, and I didn't want her to feel pressured. I took her words as honesty, not hesitation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Our friends often told us we looked like the perfect couple. They'd see us at gatherings, Clara leaning on my shoulder, the two of us finishing each other's sentences, and they'd joke about how nauseatingly in love we were. I took pride in that, not because of appearances, but because it reflected what I believed we actually shared: love, partnership, trust. One memory stands out vividly: a road trip to the coast about a year into our marriage. We drove with the windows down, music blaring, Clara singing loudly off-key just to make me laugh. We stopped at a secluded beach, spread out a blanket, and watched the sun dip into the ocean. She turned to me then, her hair tangled from the wind, and whispered, "Don't ever let me go." I kissed her forehead and promised I wouldn't. And I meant it with everything in me. That was the good part of our story, the part that made sense, the part that convinced me we could weather anything. But life has a way of testing convictions. I didn't notice it immediately, the subtle ways our connection began to shift. At first, it was just small things: Clara staying later at work or seeming distracted during dinner. I brushed it off, telling myself she was just focused on her projects. that creative people often lived in their heads. Looking back, maybe the first real sign was her silence. Clara had always been talkative with me, even about trivial things. She'd share stories about clients, or how she overheard something funny on the bus. But gradually our conversations thinned. I'd ask about her day, and she'd shrug, offering only a vague fine. She'd retreat to her sketchbook, her phone, or sometimes just stare blankly out the window. It wasn't constant, not enough to sound alarms, but enough to make me wonder if I was doing something wrong. At night, she'd roll away from me in bed, mumbling that she was tired. I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to reason with myself. People go through phases, I told myself. Stress, work deadlines, maybe even just needing personal space. I convinced myself it was temporary, that the woman who once whispered, "Don't ever let me go," was still there, just buried under the weight of everyday life. I remember one particular evening that now feels like a turning point. I had planned a small surprise, reservations at her favorite restaurant and tickets to a play she had mentioned weeks earlier. When I told her, expecting excitement, she gave me a polite smile and said, "Thanks." That was it. No spark, no warmth. I tried to shake it off, but something inside me sank. It was the first time I wondered if the woman I married was slipping away from me. At the time, though, I still clung to the good memories, to the hope that this was just a rough patch. I told myself marriages weren't supposed to be perfect all the time, that we just needed patience, maybe even a vacation to recharge. I had no idea then that the distance I was beginning to sense was only the beginning of something far deeper, something I wasn't ready to face. The shift in Clara's demeanor became more noticeable as months went by. It wasn't something sudden, not like flipping a switch, but rather a slow dimming of light, the kind you don't realize until the room is nearly dark. At first, I told myself it was work-related stress. She'd come home late, her shoulders slumped, barely speaking beyond a few tired words. I'd try to cheer her up, cooking her favorite pasta, suggesting we watch one of her beloved French films, but more often than not, she'd retreat to the bedroom early, leaving me sitting in the living room with a hollow feeling I couldn't quite explain. I remember one evening vividly. I had stayed late at work to finish a project, and when I got home, the apartment was eerily quiet. Usually, Clara would at least be sketching or playing some soft music in the background, but this time, nothing. I walked into the bedroom to find her lying on the bed, staring at the ceiling. "You okay?" I asked, gently sitting beside her. She turned her head slowly, gave me a faint smile that didn't reach her eyes, and muttered, "Just tired." I kissed her forehead, but she turned away before I could say more. That moment stayed with me, an ache I couldn't shake. Clara wasn't the type to open up easily when something weighed on her, so I tried to be patient. I figured she'd talk when she was ready. But as weeks passed, patience began to feel like neglect, as though my silence was enabling her distance. I started second-guessing myself. Was I working too much? Was I not paying enough attention? Had I stopped making her feel special? I bought her flowers one Friday, just because. She thanked me politely, placed them in a vase, and then spent the rest of the night on her phone. It was like throwing pebbles at a wall, expecting it to crumble. I confided in my friend Marcus one afternoon over lunch. He had been my college roommate, someone who knew me inside and out. I told him how things felt off, how Clara seemed detached, almost absent. Marcus frowned, stirring his coffee before replying. "Adrian, sometimes people go through phases, but sometimes it's not about you at all. It's about them. Don't carry all the blame." His words offered some comfort, but they also planted a seed of worry. If it wasn't about me, then what was it about? The first real crack came during a weekend trip we had planned to Mount Hood. Hiking had always been our thing, something that bonded us early on. I was excited, thinking maybe the fresh air and change of scenery would do us good. But from the moment we arrived, Clara seemed distant. She walked ahead of me on the trail, barely speaking, her eyes fixed on the ground. When I tried to start a conversation, she gave curt answers. At the summit, where we once would have sat for hours taking in the view, she stood silently, arms crossed, and then asked if we could head back. That night in the cabin, I confronted her gently. "Clara, talk to me. What's going on? You've been so far away lately." She sighed heavily, as though the effort of responding was too much. "I don't know, Adrian. I don't feel like myself. I pressed, asking if there was something I had done, if she was unhappy in our marriage. She shook her head but wouldn't meet my eyes. It's not you. I just don't know what's wrong. Those words should have reassured me, but instead they gnawed at me. If it wasn't me, then what was happening to us? I tried harder after that trip. I cooked more, planned small surprises, suggested new activities. I even booked a weekend at a spa resort, thinking relaxation might help. Clara went along with it, but her responses felt mechanical, like she was playing a role rather than genuinely engaging. During one dinner, as we sat across from each other in a candlelit restaurant, I realized she hadn't looked me in the eye once. It was like being with a stranger wearing her face. The most painful moments were at night. Once upon a time, Clara used to curl into me, her warmth wrapping around me like a promise. Now, she slept on the edge of the bed, her back turned. I'd reach out, lightly resting a hand on her shoulder, but she'd tense, sometimes even shift away. I told myself she was just exhausted, that physical closeness would return in time. But deep down, a fear was growing, a fear that intimacy was slipping through my fingers. One Saturday morning, I tried to bridge the gap. I woke early, made her breakfast in bed, pancakes with strawberries, her favorite. She smiled faintly when I brought the tray in, but as she took a bite, she said softly, "Adrian, you don't have to try so hard." The words pierced me. I wasn't trying hard because I had to. I was trying because I loved her. But in that moment, it felt like my efforts only highlighted the gulf between us. Around this time, I started noticing how often she was on her phone. Clara had never been much for social media, but now she seemed glued to it, fingers scrolling endlessly, screen lighting up at odd hours. I wanted to ask, but I didn't want to come across as controlling or suspicious. Still, the unease gnawed at me. Was she escaping into a world where I didn't exist? I told myself I was imagining things, that marriages had seasons, that this was just a passing winter. But the truth was harder to ignore with each passing day. Clara was withdrawing, slipping further away, and no matter how tightly I tried to hold on, she seemed determined to drift. The man I was then still believed love could fix anything, that if I just showed up enough, gave enough, loved enough, she'd find her way back to me. But life was about to show me just how wrong I was. The subtle warning signs I kept brushing aside were not just passing shadows. They were the first cracks in a foundation I had believed was unshakable. And soon, those cracks would widen into something I couldn't deny anymore. The unraveling didn't happen overnight. It came like a slow tide, creeping in until I realized the shoreline of our marriage was vanishing. After months of unease, I could no longer ignore the growing distance. Clara was there physically, yes, but emotionally she was gone. She became a shadow of the woman I once knew, moving around our apartment with a detachment that made my stomach twist. I started keeping mental notes of the changes. She no longer laughed at my corny jokes, the ones that once had her gasping for breath. The playful banter that used to flow between us turned into silence, punctuated by her distracted hums or one-word replies. Dinners became mechanical. Me asking about her day, her saying it was fine, both of us chewing in a silence so loud it was deafening. Sometimes, she'd excuse herself early, retreating to her sketch pad or scrolling endlessly on her phone, leaving me at the table staring at her untouched plate. One evening, I caught myself staring at her profile as she sat across the room. The lamplight highlighted the curve of her face, the same face that had once felt like home to me. But her eyes, they were elsewhere. Distant. Vacant. It was like she was sitting in the same room, but living in another world. My heart ached with the question I didn't want to ask. Had she already left me in her mind? The physical distance was harder to stomach. Nights were the worst. Clara had always been affectionate, curling into me in bed, wrapping her arms around me as if to say, "We're in this together." But now, she pulled away, inch by inch, until her back faced me, and the space between us grew colder with each passing week. I would reach out sometimes, brushing my hand against her arm, but she stiffened under my touch, murmuring she was tired. It was subtle at first, but eventually the rejection was undeniable. It wasn't just tiredness, it was something deeper. I tried to reason with myself. Stress, fatigue, phases that couples go through. But there was a gnawing pit in my stomach that told me this was different. I thought about Marcus's words, that maybe it wasn't about me. Still, how could I not take it personally when the woman I loved recoiled from me as though I were a stranger? The first major argument happened on a Sunday afternoon. I had suggested we take a walk, something simple to reconnect. Clara sighed, as though I'd asked her to climb a mountain. "Adrian, I'm not in the mood," she said flatly, not even looking up from her phone. My patience, worn thin by weeks of silence and coldness, snapped. "You're never in the mood anymore. For anything. Do you even want to be with me?" The words came out harsher than I intended, laced with frustration and hurt. Her reaction stunned me. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. She just looked at me with an expression I couldn't read, part pity, part detachment, and said, "I don't know." That admission hit harder than any scream could have. The uncertainty, the lack of fight. It was as though she'd already given up, but hadn't bothered to tell me. After that, the tension between us thickened. We tiptoed around each other in our own home, speaking only when necessary. I tried again to break through her wall, suggesting counseling, offering to adjust my schedule so we could spend more time together. Clara brushed it off with vague excuses. "I'm fine. I just need space." That word, space, echoed in my mind, cold and unforgiving. Space from me? Space from our marriage? Around this time, I began to notice how she lingered over her phone more than ever. Late at night, I'd wake up to see the glow of the screen illuminating her face as she turned away from me. She'd quickly lock it when she noticed me stirring. My gut twisted with suspicion, but I tried to suppress it. I didn't want to become the paranoid husband snooping through his wife's things. I wanted to trust her, but trust felt like sand slipping through my fingers. My parents noticed something was wrong when we visited them for dinner one weekend. Clara was polite but distant, barely engaging in conversation. My mother pulled me aside afterward, concern etched in her face. "Adrian, is everything okay between you two?" I forced a smile and lied, saying Clara was just tired from work. But deep inside, I knew my mother saw through me. Friends started noticing too. At gatherings, Clara kept to herself, often stepping outside to take calls or scrolling through her phone instead of joining conversations. Marcus, ever observant, caught me alone one evening and asked bluntly, "Are you sure she's still invested, man? Because from where I'm standing, it doesn't look like it." His words stung, but they echoed the doubts already consuming me. I tried everything I could think of to reignite the spark. Weekend getaways, home-cooked dinners, heartfelt conversations. But the more effort I put in, the more distant Clara seemed to become. It was as if my attempts only highlighted how far gone she already was. The harder I pulled, the faster she slipped away. Then came the night that carved itself into my memory like a scar. I reached out to hold her as she passed by me in the kitchen. She flinched, actually flinched, as though my touch burned her. I froze, my hands suspended in the air, my heart sinking. That was when I asked, voice trembling, "Do you even feel anything when I touch you anymore?" Her answer was quiet, almost casual, but it detonated inside me. "I feel nothing when you touch me." The words stripped away every illusion, every excuse I had clung to. It wasn't stress, it wasn't work, it wasn't a phase. It was emptiness. And the worst part was the blankness in her eyes as she said it, as though she were announcing a fact rather than confessing something devastating. That night, I realized the woman I loved had already left me in the ways that mattered most. But if I thought the pain of that moment was unbearable, I had no idea what was still to come. Because her confession was not the end. It was only the doorway to the truth that would shatter everything I thought I knew about love, loyalty, and myself. After Clara confessed that she felt nothing when I touched her, something inside me broke in a way I didn't know was possible. The words replayed in my head for days like a cruel echo I couldn't silence. I kept hoping she'd take them back. That maybe she had said it in a moment of frustration or exhaustion, but she didn't. In fact, she acted as though nothing unusual had happened, moving around the apartment with the same cold detachment. Meanwhile, I was left staggering under the weight of a truth I didn't want to face, that the intimacy between us, the connection I thought we still shared, was gone. I became hyper-aware of everything after that. Every time she pulled away, every time she avoided eye contact, every time she lingered on her phone. It all hit harder now that I had her admission hanging over me. I tried to bring it up again, tried to talk to her about what she meant, but Clara shut me down each time. "I just don't feel the same, Adrian. I don't know what else to tell you. Her tone wasn't cruel, but it was indifferent, and somehow that hurt more. The silence in our apartment grew unbearable. What used to be our sanctuary became a place of tension and isolation. I'd sit in the living room, staring at the television while Clara sat in the bedroom scrolling endlessly, the glow of her phone seeping under the door. Sometimes, she wouldn't even come to bed until long after I had fallen asleep, and even then, she'd stay on the edge, her back turned firmly toward me. I began to wonder if she stayed awake intentionally, just to avoid lying next to me. I started losing myself in the process. At work, I couldn't concentrate. My coworkers noticed my distracted state, my sudden tendency to zone out in the middle of meetings. Marcus called me one evening after I skipped out on our usual Friday beer. "You don't sound like you anymore," he said. "You sound like a man who's carrying the weight of two people." I didn't have the courage to admit how right he was. What unsettled me most was the secrecy that seemed to creep into Clara's life. She began taking more late nights at work, coming home with excuses that felt rehearsed. She guarded her phone with a vigilance I had never seen before, tilting the screen away from me, carrying it even into the bathroom. One night, curiosity and suspicion got the better of me. While she showered, I picked up her phone, my hands trembling. But it was locked with a new passcode I didn't know. That was the moment my suspicions hardened into certainty. There was more going on than she was admitting. I confronted her gently at first. "You've been so distant, Clara. Are you sure there isn't someone else?" She didn't lash out or deny it passionately, which would have at least reassured me. Instead, she stared at me for a long moment and then said quietly, "You're imagining things." Her words were calm, but her eyes betrayed something. Guilt, perhaps, or fear. I couldn't tell, but it haunted me. The arguments became more frequent after that. We never yelled, but the tension was sharp enough to cut the air. I'd ask her where she had been, why she didn't answer my calls, and she'd reply with clipped sentences, her patience worn thin. "I don't have to report to you every second of the day," she snapped once, her voice colder than I'd ever heard. It was like living with a stranger who wore my wife's face but none of her warmth. The breaking point for me came one Friday night. I had cooked dinner, roast chicken with rosemary, the dish that used to be her favorite. I set the table with candles, trying to recreate even a fragment of the intimacy we once had. Clara came home late, glanced at the table, and sighed. "I'm not hungry." She walked past me, straight into the bedroom, shutting the door behind her. I stood there in the dim candlelight, staring at the plates I had set, the food growing cold, and I felt like a fool. A man begging for scraps of affection from someone who had nothing left to give. In desperation, I called my sister Emily the next day. She had always been someone I trusted, someone who had seen me through ups and downs. I poured my heart out to her, telling her everything Clara had said, everything I suspected. Emily listened quietly, then said, "Adrian, you can't force someone to love you, and you shouldn't have to beg for the bare minimum. If she's already checked out, maybe you need to think about what that means for you." Her words cut deep because they held the truth I wasn't ready to face. Still, I wasn't ready to let go. I suggested marriage counseling, hoping that if we sat down with a professional, maybe Clara would open up. Maybe we could find a way back. She flatly refused. "I don't see the point," she said, her tone final. That was when I realized she wasn't just distant. She had already made her decision. She just hadn't said it out loud yet. The escalation reached its peak when I found myself waiting for her one night, long past midnight. She had told me she was working late again, but when she finally walked in, her hair slightly tousled, her face flushed, my heart sank. She avoided my gaze as she set her bag down. I wanted to ask her outright where she had been, but something stopped me. Maybe it was fear of the answer, or maybe it was the look in her eyes that told me I already knew. I spent that night sitting on the couch, staring at the darkness, realizing I was living in the shell of a marriage that had once been my everything. The woman who had once whispered, "Don't ever let me go," had already let go, and I was the only one still clinging to the wreckage. And yet, despite the pain, despite the humiliation of being treated like an afterthought, a part of me still hoped. Still believed that maybe, just maybe, she'd come back to me. But hope, as I was about to learn, can sometimes be the cruelest weapon of all. The morning after that hollow, sleepless night on the couch, I knew something inside me had shifted. For weeks, I had tried to hold on, to rationalize Clara's behavior, to make excuses for the growing void between us, but now it was undeniable. She wasn't mine anymore, not in her heart, not in her mind, and certainly not in her body. That realization pressed on me like a weight I could no longer carry alone. I needed perspective, a voice outside the storm, because drowning in my own thoughts was destroying me. So I reached out to Marcus again. I hesitated for a long time before calling, because pride kept whispering that I was a failure if I admitted the full extent of what was happening. But Marcus had been my closest friend since college, the guy who had seen me through breakups, financial struggles, and everything in between. When he answered, his voice was the same steady tone it always was. "What's going on, man? You sound like you've been through hell." I didn't hold back this time. I told him everything. Clara's confession that she felt nothing when I touched her. The late nights, the coldness, the secrecy with her phone, the dinner she had dismissed without a second glance. By the time I finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. Marcus finally said, "Adrian, I hate to say it, but it sounds like she's already halfway out the door, and you can't be the only one fighting to keep a marriage alive." His words were firm, but there was compassion in them too. You deserve better than being treated like an afterthought. That conversation shook me. Hearing Marcus articulate what I already suspected but refused to admit gave me a strange kind of clarity. It wasn't just me imagining things. It wasn't paranoia. The reality was that Clara had disengaged, and the only reason I hadn't faced it sooner was because I didn't want to. Emily, my sister, confirmed the same when I visited her the following weekend. She had invited me over for lunch, sensing from our last call that I was barely holding it together. Over plates of grilled salmon and vegetables, she watched me closely as I told her what had been going on. Emily didn't sugarcoat her response. "Adrian, I know this is hard to hear, but if Clara can tell you to your face that she feels nothing when you touch her, that's not something that just fixes itself. That's the kind of thing people only admit when they've already detached emotionally. You have to ask yourself, do you want to keep living like this, hoping she'll magically come back?" Her words hit harder than Marcus's because she spoke them with the tenderness of family, but the message was the same. I left her house that day with my mind racing, torn between the desperate hope that Clara might change and the growing evidence that she never would. Over the next few days, I began paying closer attention, not just to Clara's actions, but to my own reactions. Every small slight, her avoiding my touch, her brushing past me without acknowledgement, her endless time on her phone, felt like tiny cuts, and I realized I was bleeding out slowly, piece by piece. I remembered what Marcus had said. You can't be the only one fighting to keep a marriage alive, and he was right. That's exactly what I had been doing, fighting for two, carrying the burden alone, while she gave me nothing in return. The final confirmation came unexpectedly. One evening, Clara left her laptop open on the dining table while she went to shower. I hadn't gone looking for anything, but the screen lit up with a notification, a message from someone named Ethan. I didn't read much, just a fragment of the last message visible in the notification. "Last night was amazing. Can't wait to see you again." My stomach dropped, my heart pounding so loud I thought it might burst out of my chest. I didn't open the conversation, didn't dig further, because I didn't need to. That one line was enough to shatter whatever fragile illusion I had been clinging to. I sat there frozen, staring at the screen until it dimmed again, plunging the room back into half-darkness. I wanted to scream, to confront her the second she stepped out of the shower, but instead I found myself numb. When she walked back into the dining room, hair wrapped in a towel, humming softly as though life were normal, I couldn't bring myself to say a word. I just looked at her and felt the truth settle over me like ice. She had already replaced me in ways I hadn't wanted to admit. That night, I drove aimlessly for hours, needing space from the walls of our apartment that now felt like a prison. I parked near the lake outside town, rolled down the window, and just sat there listening to the water lapping at the shore. The air was cold, sharp in my lungs, but it cleared my head in a way nothing else had. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to imagine life without Clara, not as a loss, but as a possibility. A life where I wasn't constantly second-guessing myself, where I wasn't walking on eggshells, where I wasn't begging for scraps of affection from someone who didn't care to give them. The next morning, I made a decision. I didn't act on it yet, but it crystallized in my mind. I couldn't go on like this. Whether Clara admitted it or not, Whether she confessed or denied, the truth was already written in every moment of her detachment. I had to start preparing myself for the end. When I told Marcus about the message I had seen, he didn't hesitate. "That's your answer right there, Adrian. You don't need to catch her red-handed in a hotel room or demand an explanation. You've seen enough. Now it's about what you're going to do next." Emily echoed the same sentiment when I called her. Sometimes the hardest thing isn't seeing the truth, it's acting on it. But you can't stay in a place where love has died. It'll kill you slowly. Their voices gave me the validation I needed, the external support that anchored me when my own emotions threatened to drown me. For weeks I had been questioning my sanity, wondering if I was overreacting, but now I knew I wasn't crazy. I was a man being pushed aside in his own marriage, and if I didn't stand up for myself soon, there would be nothing left of me to save. That realization was both terrifying and liberating. Terrifying because it meant facing the end of a chapter I had built my life around. Liberating because for the first time I could see the faintest glimmer of freedom beyond the pain. I didn't know exactly when or how, but I knew the decision was coming. And when it came, there would be no turning back. The days after I discovered that message on Clara's laptop felt like a blur, as though I was walking through fog with no sense of direction. Every interaction with her became a cruel performance, where I pretended not to know what I knew and she pretended to still live in our marriage. But the truth hung between us like smoke. Unseen, yet suffocating. She still went about her routine with calculated normalcy, but I noticed the small details. The way her phone was never out of her sight. The way she lingered in front of the mirror longer than usual before heading to work. The sudden change in her perfume. Once, I even caught the faintest trace of cologne that wasn't mine clinging to her clothes when she returned home. Each clue was a dagger twisted deeper, confirming that I was sharing my life with someone who had already left me emotionally and physically. I tried for a brief moment to tell myself I could endure it, that maybe if I stayed quiet, things would stabilize, that maybe this was a temporary phase. But silence turned me into a ghost in my own home. She barely acknowledged me, often eating separately, slipping into the bedroom to text with her back turned, and sometimes even leaving me mid-conversation with nothing but an absent nod. The woman who once used to tell me her every thought and dream now guarded her words like secrets, offering me only fragments of sentences, like she couldn't be bothered to complete them. The breaking point, the true rock bottom, came one night when I decided I couldn't take the distance anymore. I asked Clara to sit down and talk. My voice was calm, my hands steady, but inside I was unraveling. "Clara, I can't keep living like this. I know something is going on. I know I've lost you, but I need you to at least be honest with me. If you're seeing someone else, just tell me." She didn't deny it. She didn't even flinch. She looked at me with eyes that held no trace of guilt, no hint of the woman I once knew. Her lips parted, and all she said was, "I don't feel the same way anymore, Adrian. I can't give you what you want." Her words were calm, almost rehearsed, but it was the look in her eyes that destroyed me. There was no love, no compassion, just detachment. I realized in that moment, she had already mourned our marriage in her own way, probably long before I even sensed something was wrong. I was the last one still holding on, clinging to ashes while she had already moved on to something or someone else. That night, after she retreated to the bedroom, I sat alone at the dining table with a half-empty glass of whiskey in my hand. The apartment was silent except for the sound of her faint laughter leaking from the other side of the closed door as she whispered into her phone. That sound broke me in ways I didn't think possible. I had reached rock bottom, not just because my wife had betrayed me, but because she didn't even care enough to hide it anymore. I wasn't just losing her, I had already lost her, and in losing her, I had begun to lose myself. I stared at the reflection of my face in the darkened window and barely recognized the man looking back. My eyes were hollow, my posture slumped. My entire being weighed down by the slow erosion of love and trust. It wasn't just the betrayal that hurt. It was the humiliation of being kept around as a placeholder. The knowledge that I had become invisible in the life I had built. The following days were some of the darkest I've ever lived. I went through the motions at work, but I felt disconnected from everything. My colleagues' laughter sounded far away, like echoes from another world. Meals lost their taste, music lost its comfort, and even sleep became a torment filled with restless dreams of Clara slipping away from me over and over again. I began to wonder if I was broken beyond repair, if I'd ever feel whole again. One evening, I broke down completely. Alone in the apartment while Clara was working late, I collapsed onto the couch and let the tears come. For the first time in years, I wept like a child, my chest heaving with the weight of everything I'd been holding back. It wasn't just about Clara. It was about the man I had become, the life I had allowed to disintegrate piece by piece while I kept pretending things could be fixed. That was the moment of absolute clarity. I couldn't save this marriage, and I couldn't keep sacrificing myself for someone who had already chosen to walk away. I remembered Emily's words, "You shouldn't have to beg for the bare minimum," and Marcus's, "You can't be the only one fighting." Their voices echoed in my head, colliding with the reality of Clara's detachment, and it all crystallized into one undeniable truth. I was done. Not out of anger, not out of revenge, but because survival demanded it. If I stayed, I would lose myself completely, and there would be nothing left of me to rebuild. That night, something inside me finally hardened into resolve. I began gathering my thoughts, considering what steps I needed to take. I didn't yet know how or when, but I knew the end had to come, and it would come by my decision, not hers. She had stripped me of affection, respect, and honesty, but she would not strip me of my final act of power, the choice to walk away. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of strength deep inside my chest, faint but undeniable. It was the kind of strength that comes only when you hit rock bottom, when there is nothing left to lose and the only way forward is up. And so, in the silence of that broken apartment, I made the final realization: my marriage was dead. All that remained was for me to bury it, and with it, the man I had been, so I could finally become someone new. Once the realization set in that my marriage was truly dead, the next step became inevitable. I had to act, but acting wasn't easy. It wasn't just a matter of packing a bag and walking out the door. It was the culmination of years of love, promises, and shared history. For nights, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my mind torn between the fear of letting go and the unbearable weight of staying. The silence of the apartment mocked me, and every laugh or text tone from Clara's side of the bedroom reminded me that she had already chosen her life beyond me. If I didn't choose mine soon, I would remain trapped in the role of a man abandoned but too afraid to leave. I started small, in ways Clara didn't notice. I began organizing my documents, pulling out old folders from the desk where our bills and joint accounts were stored. I started making copies of important papers, bank statements, the lease agreement, even my birth certificate. Each small step felt like reclaiming a piece of myself, like I was quietly gathering strength for the day I would walk away. I spoke again with Marcus, this time not as a man searching for answers, but as someone planning his escape. "I'm done, Marcus," I told him. "I can't keep living like this. She's gone, and I need to be gone too." He didn't congratulate me or push me further. He just said, "Then follow through. Don't let her drag you back in when she notices the shift. Be firm, Adrian. This is your life." Emily became my confidant as well. She offered to let me stay with her if I needed space, told me she'd support me no matter what. Her home had always felt like a refuge, and the thought of being in a place where I was genuinely wanted brought me a strange sense of comfort. "Don't be afraid to let go of something that's already let go of you," she reminded me. "You deserve more than indifference." The decisive moment came one Saturday afternoon. Clara had gone out, shopping. Her bag slung over her shoulder, her phone clutched tightly in her hand as always. I sat alone at the dining table, staring at the papers I had gathered, when a clarity washed over me so strong it almost felt physical. There was no more time to waste. I couldn't keep waiting for her to admit the affair, to confess, or to leave first. This was my life, and I had to take it back. I went into the bedroom, pulled out a suitcase from the closet, and began filling it with my clothes. The sound of the zipper felt final, like the closing of a chapter. I packed deliberately but calmly, folding shirts and stacking jeans, sliding shoes into the corners. Each item I placed in the suitcase felt like a step forward, a piece of myself reclaimed from the wreckage. By the time the bag was full, I felt lighter than I had in months. But it wasn't just about leaving quietly. I knew I needed to tell Clara, to draw the line and speak the truth she refused to acknowledge. So I sat down at the desk and wrote a letter, Not an angry one, not filled with accusations or rage, but a clear statement of what I had endured and what I was choosing. I wrote that I had loved her deeply, that I had given everything I could, but that I could not continue in a marriage where my presence meant nothing. I wrote that I knew about her distance, her secrecy, and the fact that her heart belonged elsewhere. I ended it simply. I deserve to be loved, and if you cannot give me that, then I will find it elsewhere, or at least find myself again. When Clara returned that evening, shopping bags in hand, she barely noticed the suitcase by the door. I stood up as she walked in, her face briefly lighting up when she saw me before hardening back into her usual mask of indifference. "What's this?" she asked, her tone more annoyed than surprised. "I'm leaving, Clara," I said, my voice steady. "I can't live like this anymore. I know you don't love me, and I know you've already moved on in your own way. I won't stay in a marriage where I'm invisible." For the first time in months, she didn't have a ready response. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed. She set the bags down and crossed her arms, her eyes darting to the suitcase. "So that's it? You're just walking away?" she finally asked, her tone flat. "I'm not just walking away," I replied. "I'm reclaiming my life. You told me yourself you feel nothing when I touch you. What's left for me here?" She didn't deny it. She didn't apologize. She only shrugged and muttered, "Do what you want." That was all the confirmation I needed, that my decision was right. I picked up the suitcase, placed the letter on the counter, and looked at her one last time. There was no warmth left in her eyes, no spark of the woman I had fallen in love with. In that moment, I realized she wasn't my Clara anymore and hadn't been for a long time. Without another word, I opened the door and stepped out into the cool night air. The walk to my car felt surreal, like stepping out of a cage I had lived in so long that I'd forgotten what freedom felt like. My heart pounded, my hands trembled, but beneath it all was a sense of release so profound it almost brought me to tears. I loaded the suitcase into the trunk, slid into the driver's seat, and started the engine. For the first time in months, I drove not to escape Clara, but to move towards something better, something unknown but mine. I didn't know exactly what awaited me. Maybe it was healing, maybe it was loneliness, maybe it was a chance at rediscovery. But I knew one thing for certain. I had finally chosen myself. And that choice, as terrifying as it was, felt like the first breath of real freedom. Driving away from that apartment, the life I had once shared with Clara shrinking in the rearview mirror, I expected to feel nothing but grief. And grief was there, clinging to me like a shadow, but it wasn't the all-consuming kind I had anticipated. Instead, there was a strange mixture of sorrow and relief, pain and freedom, like shedding a heavy coat after walking for miles in the summer heat. For the first time in months, I could breathe without choking on silence, without second-guessing every glance or word. I didn't know exactly where I was headed, physically or emotionally, but I knew I was no longer standing still, no longer trapped in the hollow shell of a marriage that had already ended long before I admitted it. I drove straight to Emily's house that night. When she opened the door and saw me with my suitcase, she didn't ask questions. She just hugged me, held me close, and said, "You did it. You finally did it." Her words cracked something inside me, and I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding for months. She set me up in the guest room, made me a cup of tea, and told me I could stay as long as I needed. That night I fell asleep in a bed that didn't smell of betrayal, in a room where there was no tension pressing down on me. It was the first real rest I had had in a long time. The days that followed were quiet but healing. I spent mornings on Emily's porch, sipping coffee and watching the sun climb over her garden. I started running again, rediscovering the rhythm of my body and the way fresh air cleared my head. Marcus came by one evening with a case of beer, and the two of us sat outside, talking not about Clara, but about everything else. Old college memories, work, the world. It reminded me that I wasn't defined solely by what I had lost, that I was still a person with history, with connections, with a life outside of her. Of course, Clara did try to contact me. A week after I left, she called late at night. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. Her voice was quieter than I remembered, almost fragile. "Adrian," she said, "I didn't think you'd actually leave." I let her words hang there, waiting to see if she'd follow them with an apology, a confession, anything that might resemble the woman I once loved. But all she said next was, "Can we talk?" I thought about it for a long moment, and then I said, "There's nothing left to talk about, Clara. You made your choice. I'm making mine." There was silence on the other end, followed by a small, stifled sob. For a fleeting second, I felt the old pull, the instinct to comfort her, to fix what was broken. But then I remembered the countless nights I had begged silently for her attention, the way she had looked through me like I was nothing, the cruelty of hearing her laugh with someone else while I sat alone. And just like that, the pull vanished. I ended the call, and with it I closed the door on the life we had shared. Healing didn't come overnight. There were mornings when I woke up and felt the ache of absence, when I missed the routine of sharing space with someone, even if that space had been cold. But over time, I began to realize that what I missed wasn't Clara. It was the memory of who she used to be, the version of her that no longer existed. And holding on to that ghost was what had nearly destroyed me. Letting go, though painful, was the only way forward. Slowly, I started rediscovering myself. I took up sketching again, a hobby I had abandoned years ago when work and marriage consumed me. I reconnected with old friends, some of whom I hadn't spoken to in years, and they welcomed me back without judgment. I even joined a local community group that met on weekends, where I found myself surrounded by people who didn't know me as the man whose wife had betrayed him, but simply as Adrian, the guy who laughed too loud at bad jokes and loved strong coffee. One evening, sitting by the lake where I had once parked in despair, I watched the water reflect the fading light of the sunset. The same place that had once felt like an escape now felt like a sanctuary. I realized that freedom didn't always come with joy. It came with peace. And peace, I learned, was far more valuable than clinging to a love that had long since died. The biggest lesson in all of this wasn't about betrayal or heartbreak. It was about self-worth. I had spent months, maybe years, believing that if I just held on tighter, if I just gave more of myself, Clara would return to me. But love isn't something you can drag out of someone who has already let it go. It isn't earned by suffering or by sacrifice alone. Real love requires reciprocity, respect, and presence, and without those things it becomes a prison. As I sat there, I thought about the man I had been, the one who begged for scraps of affection, who ignored his own instincts, who feared the loneliness more than he feared the slow death of his spirit. That man was gone now, buried with the marriage that had hollowed him out. In his place was someone new, someone scarred, yes, but also stronger, freer, and finally willing to choose himself. If there's one thing I've taken from this journey, it's that sometimes the bravest act is not holding on, but letting go. Walking away doesn't mean you failed. It means you refused to accept less than you deserve. It means you valued yourself enough to step out of the darkness, even when the light ahead is uncertain. So if you're listening to this, and you find yourself clinging to something that no longer nourishes you, ask yourself, are you holding on out of love or out of fear? Because love should build you, not break you. And if it's breaking you, maybe it's time to walk away and start again. For me, leaving Clara wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The beginning of a life where I am no longer invisible, where my worth isn't measured by someone else's indifference. The beginning of a journey not just toward love, but toward myself. And for the first time in a long time, that's enough. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.